The topic we're focusing on this week and probably next week as well is all experience is a story. So I have a couple of boxes full of written journals. Um, and for the last decade, I've been journaling online. So that's previous to that. And all of these are really just stories, right? All experience is a story. And so journals are just really stories of our experience of, in this case, my life. And of course, they're not just descriptions of my experiences, but also all of my reactions and responses to my experience. I couldn't cover all the things that happened, not in 2 boxes, not in 20 boxes. That would be impossible. Just as we say, it's impossible to journal everything that happens in meditation. How could I possibly journal everything that happens in a day or in a life? But what we journal is what we remember and what matters or what has resonance. So lately, I've taken on what I view as a very unusual project. I am voice dictating my journals to myself in preparation to give away the paper versions. I got an unusual request, or many of us did, from the University of Oregon Library, which has from a special collection from lesbians back in the 1970s and 1980s here in Oregon. Those of us, including myself, who lived on land in Southern Oregon and those who lived in Eugene in the 1980s. So I have often wondered, because there actually have been a lot of master's level thesis and PhD dissertations written on this topic. And a friend of mine had an exhibit in a museum on it in Ohio this past summer, I believe. So why has this time period become so interesting to researchers? Why? There's many answers to that question because, of course, there's many conditions that have led to it. But the one I most resonate with is that those times were utopian, and we're living in dystopian times now. So people want to read about those kinds of or research those kinds of utopian visions. Whatever, I don't really understand. We don't get to understand most of these kinds of things. But when I first heard the request, which was a couple of years ago, about donating journals to the collection, my first response was, no way. That is asking way too much. My journals are way too private to give to a library and share with who knows who. But then I gave it some thought, and I realized the alternative was probably that my journals would end up in a garbage can after I died. And in the meantime, I'd be lugging them around. I mean, I don't carry them around my house, but when I moved, I'd be lugging them. But there was a dharmic understanding here. Am I really the same person that I was 50 years ago? Not really. So then what was I protecting? What was I ashamed of? And that question was really pivotal to me to really get to the point of saying yes. That, along with the alternative of being in a garbage can or in a library, I don't know, that choice seemed a little clear cut. But this dharmic question, am I the same person? Yes. As I read them, it turns out that I have some of the same priorities and interests, and a lot is different and evolved. So the reason I'm voice dictating this is because I came up with it. It seemed like a really efficient process. I couldn't imagine writing them all by hand, but I sit down and I read them to myself. And, this wonderful thing called voice dictation gets them into a document. But it turns out that the process itself is so different from reading them silently, and of course, very different from not reading them at all. Okay, so yeah, some of this is really sad, even heartbreaking. It's a struggle to be a young person. Though some of it is inspiring to hear my younger self working to find her way. Much of it has a feminist bent. And I wrote a lot about how I didn't have a voice as a woman, how hard it was to speak up about my needs. But back to the Buddhist question, am I the same person now that I was then? There is clearly some through line of who I am now. And some of reading this gives more context and depth to understanding myself now. And also, what a relief to see I'm free of some of the things that plagued me back then. So, of course, all of this is a story, and the story that I narrated about my life to myself then. And again, the stories have evolved. Now, I was actually surprised to see how much I was interested in spirituality back then, much like now, and how much my life centered around it. I of course remembered I had a spiritual teacher back then, and I remembered we had a falling out, but I didn't know how much I perceived it myself as having put her on a pedestal. I wrote about this and what that was like when she fell off in her humanness. And I really didn't remember how agonizing that was for me and how I needed to let go of her as a teacher. Some things continue. There was a lot in these journals about relationships. It was really hard to come out as a lesbian in rural Southern Oregon in the early 1970s. I truthfully had forgotten the agony of that. What it was like to be in the closet, what it was like to not be mirrored, how my pent up needs exploded in my first serious lesbian relationship. What a relief to be through those kinds of times, and to be just in this more quiet married life. Back then, I didn't remember this at all. I didn't know this until I read it. I was quite philosophical and reflective. Boy, that continues. And remembering this and reading about this really made me happy. So I think that our journals are sacred. Others don't see it that way. I know of several people who have really burned their journals. They made that choice because they wanted to rid themselves of as I see it, rid themselves of the dukkha that was there in their journals. Now, that's a very different choice, sort of opposite from what I'm doing now, a very different view on journals. And people have very different views on stories, whether they're worthy of our attention. And certainly, different meditative paths have different views of stories, whether they're worthy of our attention. As no doubt you know, we think our stories are worthy of our attention. So I'm really fortunate that my stories have evolved. And one description of the evolution would be they've evolved from less dukkha through knowing my dukkha. Again, the first truth or the first ennobling. My journals back then were my confidant. In a sense, I projected on my journals someone who actually could hear my dukkha. And I believe that part of how my stories evolved was by journaling this way of knowing my dukkha. And knowing my dukkha, I believe, propelled my motivation to growth and healing. And I feel really grateful for the good fortune, because many people do not have this, to be able to focus my life on my healing, my own and that of others. So with that, I will end this talk.